In the spring of 1942, to celebrate the success of the Iceland Understanding, a state dinner was given at the White House by President and Mrs. Lindbergh to honor Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop, who was known to have touted Lindbergh to his Nazi colleagues as Germany's ideal American presidential candidate long before the Republican Party drafted Lindbergh at its 1940 convention. Von Ribbentrop was the negotiator seated at Hitler's side throughout the Iceland meetings, and the first Nazi leader to be invited to America by any government official or agency since the fascists had come to power nearly 10 years before. No sooner was the announcement of the von Ribbentrop dinner made public than strong criticism was voiced by the liberal press, and rallies and demonstrations were staged all across the country protesting the White House's decision. For the first time since he left office, former President Roosevelt emerged from seclusion to make a brief nationwide address from Hyde Park urging President Lindbergh to rescind the invitation for the sake of all freedom-loving Americans, and particularly the tens of millions of Americans of Eastern European stock whose ancestral countries might live beneath the Nazis' crushing yoke. Roosevelt was immediately attacked by Vice President Wheeler for playing politics with the sitting president's conduct of foreign affairs. It wasn't merely cynical, said the vice president, but utterly irresponsible of him to argue for the same dangerous policies that had all but dragged America into a bloody European war while the New Deal Democrats were running the country. Wheeler was himself a Democrat, a former three-term senator from Montana, and the first and only member of the opposition party to be chosen to share a ticket with a presidential candidate since Lincoln picked Andrew Johnson as his second-term running mate in 1864. Early in his political career, Wheeler was so far to the left that he'd been the voice of Butte's radical labor leaders, the enemy of Anaconda Copper, the mining company that ran Montana pretty much like a company store, and as an early supporter of FDR's had been suggested as his vice presidential candidate in 1932. He first departed the Democratic Party in 1924 to team up with Wisconsin's reformist Senator Robert Lafayette on the Union-supported Progressive Party presidential ticket, and then, after abandoning Lafayette and his supporters in the non-communist American left, he joined Lindbergh and the right-wing isolationists in helping to found America First, attacking Roosevelt with anti-war statements so extreme that they prompted the president to label his criticism the most untruthful, dastardly, unpatriotic thing that has been said in public life in my generation. Wheeler had been chosen by the Republicans to be Lindbergh's running mate, in part because his own political machine in Montana had helped elect Republicans to Congress throughout the late 30s, but mainly to persuade the American people of the strength of the bipartisan support for isolationism, and to have on the ticket a combative, un-Lindbergh-like candidate whose job would be to attack and revile his own political party at every opportunity, as he did in the press conference with the vice president's office when he predicted that if the reckless, war-minded rhetoric in Roosevelt's message from Hyde Park was any indication of the campaign the Democrats intended to wage in the forthcoming elections, they would suffer even greater congressional losses than they had in the 1940 Republican landslide. The very next weekend, the German-American Bund filled Madison Square Garden with a near-capacity crowd, some 25,000 people who had turned out to support President Lindbergh's invitation to the German foreign minister and to denounce the Democrats for their renewed warmongering. During Roosevelt's second term, the FBI and congressional committees investigating the Bund's activities had immobilized the organizations, designating it a Nazi front and bringing criminal charges against leaders in its high command. But under Lindbergh, government efforts at harassing or intimidating Bund members ceased, and they were able to regain their strength by identifying themselves not only as American patriots of German extraction, opposed to America's intervention in foreign wars, but as staunch enemies of the Soviet Union. The deep fascist fellowship uniting the Bund was now masked by vociferous patriotic declamations on the peril of a worldwide communist revolution. As an anti-communist, rather than a pro-Nazi organization, the Bund was as anti-Semitic as before, openly equating Bolshevism with Judaism in propaganda handouts and harping on the number of pro-war Jews like Treasury Secretary Morgenthau and financier Bernard Barak, who'd been Roosevelt's confidants, and of course holding fast to the purposes enunciated in their official declaration on first organizing in 1936 to combat the Moscow-directed madness of the Red World menace and its Jewish bacillus carriers, and to promote a free Gentile-ruled United States. Gone, however, from the 1942 Madison Square Garden rally were the Nazi flags, the swastika armbands, the straight-armed Hitler salute, the stormtrooper uniforms, and the giant picture of the Fuhrer that had been on display for the first rally on February 20th, 1939, an event promoted by the Bund as George Washington Day birthday exercises. Gone were the banners proclaiming "Wake Up America, Smash Jewish Communists," and the references by speechmakers to Franklin D. Roosevelt as Franklin D. Rosenfeld, and the big white buttons with the black lettering that had been distributed to Bund members to stick onto their lapels, the buttons that read, "Keep America out of Jewish war." Meanwhile, Walter Winchell continued to refer to the Bundists as Bundits, and Dorothy Thompson, the prominent journalist and wife of novelist Sinclair Lewis, who'd been expelled from the 1939 Bund rally for exercising what she called her constitutional right to laugh at ridiculous statements in a public hall, went on denouncing their propaganda in the same spirit she'd demonstrated 3 years earlier when she'd exited the rally shouting, "Bunk, bunk, bunk, Mein Kampf, word for word!" And on his Sunday night program following the Bund rally, Winchell contended with his usual cocksureness that growing hostility to the von Ribbentrop state dinner marked the end of America's honeymoon with Charles A. Lindbergh. "The presidential blunder of the century," Winchell called it, "the blunder of blunders, for which the reactionary Republican henchmen of our fascist-loving president will pay with their political lives in the November elections." The White House, accustomed to nearly universal defecation of Lindbergh, the White House, accustomed to nearly universal deification of Lindbergh, seemed stymied by the strong disapproval that the opposition was so rapidly able to muster against him. And through the administration sought to distance itself from the Bund's New York rally. The Democrats, determined to associate Lindbergh with the organization's ignominious reputation, held a Madison Square Garden rally of their own. Speaker after speaker scathingly denounced the Lindbergh Bundists, until, to everyone's astonished delight, FDR himself appeared on the platform. The 10-minute ovation his presence elicited would have gone on even longer had not the former president called out forcibly above the roar, my fellow Americans, I have a message for both Mr. Lindbergh and Mr. Hitler. The moment compels my stating with candor they cannot misunderstand that it is we and not they who are the masters of America's destiny." Words so stirring and dramatic that every human being in the crowd, and in our living room, and in the living rooms up and down our street, was swept away by the joyous illusion that the nation's redemption was at hand. "The only thing we have to fear," FDR told his audience, recalling the opening words of a sentence as renowned as any ever spoken at a first inaugural, "is the obsequious yielding to his Nazi friends by Charles A. Lindbergh, the shameless courting by the president of the world's greatest democracy of a despot responsible for innumerable criminal deeds and acts of savagery, a cruel and barbaric tyrant unparalleled in the chronicle of man's misdeeds. But we, Americans, will not accept a Hitler-dominated America. We, Americans, will not accept a Hitler-dominated world. Today, the entire globe is divided between human slavery and human freedom. We choose freedom. We accept only an America consecrated to freedom. If there is a plot being hatched by anti-democratic forces here at home harboring a quisling blueprint for a fascist America, or by foreign nations greedy for power and supremacy, a plot to suppress the great upsurge of human liberty of which the American Bill of Rights is the fundamental document, a plot to replace the American democracy with the absolute authority of a despotic rule such as enslaves the conquered people of Europe, let those who would dare in secret to conspire against our freedom understand that Americans will not, under any threat or in the face of any danger, surrender the guarantees of liberty framed for us by our forefathers in the Constitution of the United States." Lindbergh